Hello, sisters and brothers, comrades and friends. Welcome to the very first episode of my podcast, Live Mike with Mike Palecek. We are broadcasting live from the National Capital Region of Soviet Kazakhstan here on November 26th, 2020, Thursday. We've got a couple of guests joining us tonight. First up, we'll have Niki Ashton, Member of Parliament, NDP Member of Parliament, will be joining us to talk about the realities of politics in a pandemic in Canada, followed by our friend Dr. Arash Azizi, journalist, author. He'll be joining us to discuss his new book on Iran and General Soleimani in the second half. But before that, I got a few things I'd like to talk about. Now, 2020 has obviously been a really difficult year for everyone. It's appropriate that the first episode of the show we're going to be talking a lot about the pandemic, because obviously it's totally upended the world and has decisively shifted history, frankly. I think it's difficult to even convey the effects that this pandemic is going to have for many years to come. I think it's obvious to a lot of us the immediate effects, because we felt them. Essential workers are having to brave this situation and go to work every day to keep things running for us. People with any sorts of any vulnerabilities, medical vulnerabilities, have had to live in more or less complete isolation, which obviously takes its toll on people. The good news, of course, is that the end is in sight. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're seeing a whole series of different vaccine trials are in their final stages. It's looking like many of them are going to be successful vaccines. And so what that means is that it's likely this pandemic is going to be knocked down fairly soon, or at least by the end of cold and flu season. COVID-19 is going to be around probably with us forever. We'll deal with it as a seasonal illness going forward, but we won't have to look at it with the same. It won't pose the same crisis, and particularly the vaccines coming online is what's going to help us in years in future as cold and flu seasons come along. So although we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we can see that the pandemic is almost over, we should understand that the effects of this pandemic, the political effects, the economic effects, are going to last much, much longer. And let's be honest, the capitalist system, the system that we live in, isn't the greatest system for handling crises. Usually it puts all of the costs of different crises onto working class people. And we're in a bit of almost like a bubble period where we haven't felt the long-term effects of this pandemic yet. And we will soon. We've been dealing with the immediate effects, with the strains on medical systems, the people, essentially the shutdown of most of society. We've been dealing with those immediate effects. But through this, a tremendous debt has been incurred and continues to be incurred in order to support people through this pandemic. And I think what we need to be prepared for, what the left needs to be prepared for, and what the labor movement needs to be prepared for, frankly, is a wave of austerity that's going to grip not just this country, but around the world following this pandemic. Let's be clear about this. They are going to make working class people pay for this crisis one way or another. Now, it's become almost cliche to say that 2020 is the worst year of our lives. Everybody hates 2020. It's a terrible year. It's been a terrible year for me, probably for you and everyone else you know. But we should understand in all of this that 2020 hasn't been a terrible year for everyone. 2020 has been a great year if your name happens to be Jeff Bezos. 2020 has been a great year if your name is Elon Musk. The billionaires of this world have added untold billions to their fortunes. 2020 has been a fantastic year for the richest of the rich because they've taken advantage of this crisis the way they take advantage of every crisis. Normally, when you have this sort of crisis gripping society, there are always large changes that go on almost unnoticed, but structural changes, and those are happening now. The pandemic vastly accelerated the shift from retail shopping to online shopping for obvious reasons. And so we've seen this massive growth in shopping online, which was, of course, happening already, but it's been accelerated. Now, that's not just going to be undone when the virus is contained. These structural changes that have happened economically are going to persist long after the pandemic. And what we've seen is the same thing that we see with every crisis. The billionaire class is taking advantage. They're using the crisis to advance the changes, the structural changes that they already wanted to see economically, and they've capitalized incredibly off of it. Elon Musk has made tens of billions of dollars this year. The supposed worst year in history, the billionaires seem to be doing just fine. And how have they reacted to this? I'm picking on Elon Musk in this, but it's because of the way he has reacted to this pandemic. Now, let's not forget that when the lockdown happened earlier this year, when production shut down all across North America, in California, where Musk has his headquarters and some of his factories for Tesla, he at one point insisted that he was going to reopen his factory illegally. Even though every other business in the state was being shut down, even though there were emergency procedures and laws in place, Elon Musk announced that he was opening Tesla. And you know what? He did illegally, and he dared the government to come shut him down. He dared them. And he said that if they did, he would move Tesla's headquarters out of California. Well, you know what? They eventually backed down. For reasons I cannot fathom, the authorities decided that billionaires, in fact, are above the law. They can do what they want when they want. And so the Tesla factory was allowed to reopen, even though it was violating the pandemic restrictions. Musk called their bluff. So the billionaires have done quite well this year. I saw Musk was moved up to the Ford's up the Forbes Billionaires list, and I've seen different things quoted in the last couple of days. He's either the second richest man in the world or the third richest man in the world because he's done quite well in this pandemic. Over at the richest person in the world, of course, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, he's obviously done very, very well through this pandemic as people have shifted more and more to retail shopping or to online shopping instead of going into stores through the pandemic. Bezos has done incredibly well for himself. Yet it's in Amazon warehouses all over North America, you'll find atrocious working conditions. You'll find people who try to organize for better conditions, who try to organize for unionization or even for basic health and safety, personal protective equipment during a pandemic. You'll find them attacked by management, rooted out, often fired. I can go into one story after another, but I'm not going to. The point is, the billionaire class have made off like bandits in 2020, and they've behaved like bandits in 2020. Yet, these are exactly the people who are going to be demanding early next year that the working class pay for this crisis. Even though they've made untold billions, they will be trying to put the cost of this onto the shoulders of working class people, and they're going to do that in a myriad of ways, both from attacks on social services, on basic workers' rights, on the cost of living for ordinary people, but even more blatant things. The bosses over at Deutsche Bank have come up with a great idea. They've decided, and they've announced this, they're urging governments to look at this, that workers that are forced to work from home during this pandemic should pay a privilege tax for the privilege of working from home. Now, I'm not opposed to privilege taxes. I think maybe we should talk about some privilege taxes for the bosses at Deutsche Bank. They don't seem to understand what privilege is. But they think workers should pay for this. And it's particularly insidious the way they always seek to divide working people. They understand that when working people stand together, we have power. We can change society when we stand together. The billionaires understand that. So they always seek ways to divide working people. And in this case, it's all those workers who are working from home. They have the privilege. And they're going to go and stir this up with essential workers that are forced to come in because of the nature of their work and the importance of their work. They're going to be stirring this up with them, saying, oh, those people working from home, they sure have the good life. You don't get that. The same divide and conquer tactics that they always pick on, they always pick up with every issue. It's reliable. You can almost set a clock by it. Every time there's a major issue, the bankers and big business are trying to find ways to divide working people around it. Racism, fantastic tool for them. They're very happy to stoke all kinds of racism. Public sector versus private sector workers. They create all of these artificial divides to divide working people, to prevent us from standing together, because they understand that we are more powerful than the billionaires when we stand together. But when we're atomized, when working class people are divided and fighting each other, well, it's an easy time for the ruling class. So, as I said, 2020 has been a horrible year for most of us. It's been a fantastic year for some people. And all of this asks the question is, where's the labor movement in all of this? Where is the organized working class? And, that's a big topic, and there's a few points that I'd like to touch on. One is the question of leadership, which is vastly lacking throughout the working class movement. Um, the trade union movement has become accustomed to trying to manage all of the problems that are put on their desks, on their tables, and desperately trying to keep up. Um, we're so trapped inside the box that they've put us in. It's very hard to think outside of it, especially in times of crisis. And yet, it's precisely at those transitionary points where working class leadership has so much power. And I would think about a point earlier in this year that I think was an opportunity lost. And I don't think many people even noticed it as it went by. But after the lockdown, or as they began to open up, they started opening up different businesses, different sectors, one thing at a time by the command of government, and it was different in different places. That was actually the perfect opportunity for the leadership of the labor movement to step up and to take control of the situation. And oftentimes, these things aren't obvious until after they pass. A far-sighted and anti-capitalist leadership of the labor movement might have seen things differently, but what's there presently did not. And I think that moment of reopening was actually a moment where the labor movement could have stepped in and said, not a single workplace will be reopening in this country without the direction of the Canadian labor movement. Now, that seems like a tall order, but it absolutely could have been done, and the Canadian Labour Congress in particular could have been dictating the terms upon which the economy reopened. We could have been looking at this from a place of power, but we didn't. We stood back, and that opportunity was missed. And like I said, I think these things aren't as obvious in the moment. They become more obvious afterwards. But I think it's fair to say that the response we've seen to the pandemic so far from the broad leadership of the labor movement has been quite insufficient. There's been all sorts of spontaneous work floor driven actions, people walking out when they're not feeling safe and that sort of thing, and that's great and it needs to continue. But we haven't seen union leaders out leading that charge. And that's something that needs to change. Over at the Canadian Labour Congress, the CLC is an absolute crisis right now. This is something that needs to be dealt with and needs to be dealt with urgently. And I'm not even just talking about the lackluster response to the pandemic, but recently the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Hassan Youssef, who is beyond his term, he's now serving in emergency capacity because obviously the convention was postponed because of the pandemic, so he's serving as president in an emergency capacity. He steps out all on his own a couple weeks ago and does something unprecedented. He signs a joint statement with the Chamber of Commerce, the class enemy, the representatives of big business in this country, signed a letter with the president of the Canadian Labour Congress to endorse a former Liberal minister, Bill Morneau, to go on and lead the OECD. Now, he did this all on his own without the support of the other unions. In fact, most of the big affiliates of the Canadian Labour Congress have come out very quickly saying, we do not agree with this. We do not agree with this position. And they've made it known that when Hassan Youssef endorsed Bill Morneau, he was speaking on behalf of himself, not on behalf of the Canadian labor movement. But that isn't supposed to be possible, sisters and brothers. I mean, when you're heading the organization, you can have all kinds of ideas about what the best thing is to do, and you put those ideas forth and you try to win debates and arguments around them and so on. But you don't just go off all on your own making decisions, particularly something on the level of an endorsement of Bill Morneau. Now, this guy hasn't exactly been a friend to the working class. He legislated my union back to work and took away our right to strike. This is the guy that tried to bring in target benefit plans, pensions, into law federally. It was potentially a massive attack on defined benefit pension plans and retirement security for workers in this country. Luckily, it was stopped in its tracks, no thanks to Bill Morneau. And yet, here we have the president of the Canadian Labour Congress endorsing him to go on and lead this international body that's done nothing but attack workers for most of its existence. The OECD is basically a right-wing think tank for international corporate domination. I don't know what would possess a labor leader to think that we have any horse in this race. And yet, here we have it. So, this first podcast, it's happening in crazy times, really. Sisters and brothers, comrades, we have an unprecedented crisis facing us on a global scale, a humanitarian crisis. We have an economic crisis, which is coming out of that. And I think it's fair to say that we have a crisis in leadership in the labor movement. We haven't seen leaders that are prepared to rise to the challenge that history is posing. And that's what we're going to have to see over the coming days and coming weeks and months, because believe me, as soon as this pandemic is under control, they are going to do everything they can to make the working class pay for this pandemic. I expect to see massive attacks against living standards and basic rights for workers. I expect to see tax increases for working class people, and I expect to see gutting of collective agreements and social programs. That's the direction that they'll be headed coming out of this crisis. They will try to make the working class pay, and it's our responsibility, sisters and brothers, to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's going to require a very broad mobilization, but coming out of this pandemic, we're going to have to be prepared to fight, because believe me, the billionaires that have done very well in 2020 are going to be prepared to fight. So we're at a pivotal moment. We're at a pivotal moment for the working class movement and indeed for world history. I hope we're up to the challenge. As I said, I expect we'll see various attacks coming, and we need to be prepared to mobilize in the spring to face those attacks. But this pandemic, of course, it's transformed our daily lives, but it's also really transformed politics and is changed the way that politics to operate. And joining me now for the very first guest on this program is our good friend, NDP Member of Parliament, Niki Ashton. Niki's joining us on the line from northern Manitoba, and hopefully this is going to work here. Niki, do we have you on? No, we don't have you on. Oh, 1 second, I see. We're just having some connection problems with Niki. As I said, she's joining us from northern Manitoba on the line, and as you know, they don't quite have high-speed internet working all across this country yet. It gets a little sketchy sometimes. So I think we maybe have you here, Niki. Can you hear me? I still can't hear you. Well, hang on. We're just having a little trouble connecting up here. Tell you what, I'm going to play you guys a song, and in the meantime, I'm going to try and get Niki Ashton online here. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do with this podcast is put on labor music and left-wing music whenever I can for people to listen to. And so the first song we're going to play here is actually from an album that was recorded with my band, the Apparatchiks. And this album was released last year. The song is called Anthropcene, and I'm going to play it now. Hopefully, as soon as we got this rolling, we'll have Niki Ashton on when we come back.
Fellow workers, pay attention to what I'm gonna make. Smart machines will make us dumb. Bankers sell the robbers guns.
Can you hear me?
Workers fight.
Yeah, I can hear you, and I was like watching
rich
you on,
get
on
rich
my laptop
and
anyway.
poor get poor. Yeah.
Is it
Humanity is on the
coming through?
The slaves will fight the master class. Donald Trump can kiss my ass. Everyone's blind in the land of the free, 'cause you can't learn something you refuse to see. And we better change something fast. Anthropocene. Would you be my queen?
Mike, can you hear me?
Right at
see you.
the end of the world with me.
All right. After some technical difficulties, I think we've got Niki on the line here. Niki, can you hear us?
I can.
Fantastic. My apologies about that. I'm playing both engineer, producer, and host here, but I think we've got this working now, and we'll bring you on. So welcome to the show, Niki.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm just thrilled to be here, and I want to congratulate you on getting this podcast started. I know that many of us across the country have been waiting since you started talking about it, and then you started promoting it. You are, I think, in a very difficult time. Creating such an important opportunity for us to come together and build the solidarity that many of us are missing right now, and the solidarity that we need going forward. To push back on some very difficult circumstances, and for a better a better tomorrow for all of us.
Thanks. I think with it, so many people sort of locked up at home, I know I'm certainly missing contact with people and missing the solidarity that we get from and the common purpose that we get from being involved in the movement. But that's the reality of politics during a pandemic, I guess. And so I guess let's get right into that. How has this pandemic affected politics on the Hill? How has it affected your job?
Well, first of all, I'm it's affected it in such a way that I'm not on the Hill, and very much doing the work of representing our part of the country, advocating for our part of the country. As many people know, since Parliament shut down in mid-March, while we did have a few weeks where nothing was happening, there was a couple of emergency sittings. I'm really proud that the NDP was a force in pushing for a virtual and now hybrid Parliament to make democracy work during this challenging time to the best, at least, of our ability. And it's been very important for our part of the country. Mike, anybody following what's happening with COVID knows that Manitoba has not been faring well. Our province has been in code red now for over a week. So major shutdowns, and really our region here in the north has been under a travel ban since the beginning of September because we are particularly vulnerable when it comes to COVID-19. So it's been very important for me to be very active in the virtual Parliament setting and to do everything we can to create noise about the major challenges that First Nations are facing, that working people working in industrial settings here in our region are facing, what many families are facing, very worried about being able to go to work when they don't have childcare, and many women, for example, here, like other parts of the country, have had to stay home by no choice of their own because they don't have another choice, right? So our region is going through some serious challenges. COVID-19 wreaking havoc in a number of communities. The military actually just arrived last week in one part of our constituency. And I think we've seen very clearly here in Manitoba, like other parts of the country, that austerity kills. That regressive right-wing politics that places profit ahead of public health and the lives of people is, you see it here. You see it here in Manitoba. Now we know, of course, Alberta has surpassed everyone where COVID is frankly out of control, is what we're hearing, right? So this is a very difficult time, and it's been very important for me as to do everything possible in this new virtual world to connect our communities and to fight for our voices to be heard, to fight for action, and to fight for justice.
And so, what would you say is the biggest challenge that your constituents are facing through the pandemic?
Well, I would say, this is, as many may know, northern Manitoba, not unlike much of northern Canada, which ironically produces, enormous wealth for this country in terms of resource extraction, is one of the poorest parts of the country. So little of that wealth comes back to the community produce it. We know that much of this extraction is happening on lands, and very little of it with the consent and support of First Nations, and and the poorest, some of the poorest communities in our country are here in in our region, and so the COVID crisis has magnified the inequality that our region faces, and that particularly First Nations people face. So the housing crisis, the lack of access to hospitals and broader health care, the isolation, in communities that don't have all weather roads, despite the fact that they're in pretty southern zones in the country. It's all of those factors have made them so vulnerable, and what we have is a federal government that right now is trying to play catch up as COVID-19 pops up in First Nations communities, as people struggle, and then all the while, the federal government should have been turning the clock back on decades of neglect when it comes to critical infrastructure in these communities, and lifting people up, respecting Indigenous rights. And I also want to point out that workers in our part of the country are very much struggling. I've worked with First Nations leaders fighting to temporarily shut down a work camp just north of us here. And in fact, this painting is from one of the First Nations that I worked with, as a thank you for the advocacy that we've done together, and it's ongoing advocacy. And it's absolutely grotesque, the extent to which corporations want to continue to operate work camps, which we know have been proven to be vectors in the spread of COVID-19, and are finding all sorts of loopholes to not implement protections that public health has asked them to do, and prefer to operate at the expense of the health of their workers. And in our region, it's particularly dangerous given the vulnerability of workers that come from First Nations, bringing it back to their communities that don't have the capacity to handle it. So we've dealt with outbreaks. We're dealing with very challenging conditions. We're dealing with a provincial government that has pushed forward an austerity agenda from the beginning of this crisis, and a federal government that talks a good talk. And I will acknowledge that there have been some important immediate responses, but are failing to deal with the longer term issues and structural issues that so many in our region face.
Right, and so the government obviously is pretty wrapped up in the response to this crisis, and it seems that they've really, tried to bring everyone along, at least for political cover. But the NDP has managed to, I guess, extract some concessions out of this government around it. I'm not sure if we're at the end of that or not. But can you go over a little bit about what's actually been done in the last couple of months? What has the NDP been able to accomplish through the crisis, and what difference does that make for working people here?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is an important question because, of course, the media gives Trudeau for a lot of credit, when it comes to the cash infusions, the financial support that many Canadian small businesses have received. But the reality that the NDP was the first to push for these, whether it's the CERB model that of course existed up until about a month ago, transitioned into a new form of EI. It was the NDP that pushed for an increase in the wage subsidy program, which I know has been a point of concern. But I know in regions like ours, for example, it has allowed workers to keep working in some pretty important push for student support, right? Trudeau at the beginning was talking about students going to pick berries and pack fillet fish in fish plants, right? And then he talked about students moving back to their parents' house, the real world he is. But it was the NDP that pushed for student support. Inadequate. It ended up, but it was something. And it was the NDP that pushed for disability supports. And I will say that is probably the most egregious element of Trudeau's platform in terms of direct assistance to Canadians, given that he only came up with a $600 one-time payment for folks that are most on the margins, never mind that many people living with disabilities can't even apply for it. But nevertheless, these are important points that the NDP pushed for. I'm also proud of the work that we've done to hold them to account on a number of issues throughout this pandemic. Particularly when it comes to the way in which they've spent money to benefit their rich friends, money that should and could have gone to Canadians during this crisis. And, I know there's been a lot of attention to the WE scandal. While there's been other scandals out there, and I'll just give you one example. Our team worked really hard to expose a contract that was given to a First Nation, a remote First Nation in our region, for these really fancy medical tents, and that they never asked for. In fact, somebody had heard about a CBC story profiling a Newfoundland-based company making these great medical tents for their First Nation. And they said, well, hold up, we didn't order these. We don't want these. And after some digging, some media prodding on our end, we uncovered that, yes, in fact, the federal government signed a contract for $750,000 with this Canadian company, this Newfoundland-based company with connections to Alberta, to build this very fancy tent that a First Nation not only did not ask for, but the same First Nation had asked for some very clear, concrete funding to renovate their youth center so that it could be used as a potential facility for self-isolation. So, not only is there, major continued exploitation of First Nations in this case, but and the other part of this is that the chair of the board of this Newfoundland-based company is a former Liberal provincial cabinet minister, right? So here we are, the Liberals again benefiting their Liberal friends. Now we know about the Amazon, the Amazon contract. We know about the contract for the former NP who's now building ventilators. We know about some of the questionable spending around PPE. We also know that there's a lot we don't know because the Trudeau government is refusing to allow access based on what they call national security reasons. So there's a lot more work to be done. And I would say what we really need, going forward is a very strong analysis. And you talked about this, about the ways we need to have the back of working Canadians and Canadians on the margins going forward. I think we are at the end of the line of working with the Trudeau government in any significant way to get concessions, as you pointed out, for Canadians. But I think what we've seen, and you pointed it out in your intro so eloquently as you always do, Mike, that this crisis has set workers, working families further back, while the richest among us, including here in our own country, we have our own billionaires, have only become richer. And that's something that we need to get back to taking on.
Right. And so what do you think the long-term repercussions of this pandemic are going to be? I touched on it a little bit off the top that I expect a major wave of austerity following this, but I think there are some prolonged sort of structural economic changes that are coming out of this. For example, as we've learned in the last number of days, Canada no longer has vaccine production capacity. And as a result, most industrialized countries are going to have vaccines available before we get them here, because they're going to take care of themselves first, obviously. I think that maybe speaks to the entire neoliberal economic model that we've just spent 30 years shoving down everyone's throats. I think we're seeing some of the limits of that, and I would hope that after this, maybe some people in positions of authority might realize that having domestic vaccine production would be a valuable thing going forward. But I think that's just one of many examples. What can we expect to see following this?
Well, I want to reflect on the fact that there was a moment earlier on in this pandemic where I think many of us had tremendous hope that that things could change, right? Especially as we began to recognize very early on that we had very little domestic capacity to keep us safe. Period, right? Whether it's our inability to produce N95 masks, our inability to make our own ventilators, you name it. Canada had, very little capacity, has very little capacity to do anything that we need. We also know, we heard about the reports that warned us that we weren't stockpiling, that we weren't prepared coming out of SARS, coming out of H1N1, all of this, right? But to your point, I mean, the neoliberal agenda, the agenda of privatization, of austerity, of job-killing trade deals led us to a point where Canada and most importantly Canadians were left incredibly vulnerable, and some more vulnerable than others, right? And I was for me it has been very important to speak out about the need to bring back these key areas under public ownership, right? And and I want to acknowledge that there have been folks that have been on the front end of that. Green Jobs Oshawa, for example, who said, let's repurpose our plant to make the PP and even the ventilators that we need. And of course, in true liberal fashion, the Liberals took that idea and twisted it into giving GM the contract to do what they wanted to do, and most of it wasn't exactly what Canadians needed. So, what we need is, I would say, is we need to pardon me. We need to revisit that moment of great hope. And we need to recognize that much like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and our own Canadian homegrown billionaires are becoming richer, we are standing to benefit coming out of this pandemic. Continue to benefit coming out of this pandemic. We need to get back to fighting for some progressive approaches and a progressive vision to rebuilding and taking back what we need to keep our communities safe, to keep our people across our country safe. And I agree with you that we are. There's nothing to say that we're going to head in a better direction when it comes to the way we structure our economy if we continue going down this path. And that's why I think it's so important, as you point out, to have strong grassroots-based advocates in the labor movement. That's why it's so important to have that at the political level, including the kinds of ideas that we're putting as the NDP. We've seen the way in which the status quo has failed us. It's important that we have the courage to put forward progressive ideas, including through public ownership, and saying no to further privatization, saying no to further job-killing trade deals going forward.
So what's next for the NDP then? What's the priority? I guess on the Hill, even though you're not there at the moment, and I mean, really, how long are we going to be propping up this Liberal government? Are we going to see an election at some point soon?
Well, I would say that I think the Liberals, and we saw the potential of an election just a few weeks ago. I think the Liberals, if they continue on their ascent, even a minimal one, will be keen to go to the polls. We know that the average minority lasts no more than 2.5 years. So we're certainly, starting in the new year, getting to the zone that where it would be even normal, let alone a pandemic, to go to an election. Yeah, I think Trudeau is keen to pull the plug the moment it seems remotely beneficial to him. And I think it's very important that the NDP be very clear about who we represent, not only in terms of the work we've done so far, pardon me, but in terms of fighting for those that have been left behind throughout this pandemic, like the working class, like working people, all of these essential workers, for example, that we've thanked and shared Facebook posts about, and seen Trudeau and all of our leaders give these emotional messages to. Where is the commitment to a living wage? Where is the plan around sick days? Where is the protection around health and safety? Where is the support for precarious workers, right? And where is the protection for industrial workers, many of whom have continued to work throughout this crisis in jobs that are not essential, but the push to have them keep producing at the expense of their own public health has constantly been there, right? So I think it's very important for the NDP to be to get back to sort of where we come from, and be that voice, and work alongside grassroots labor activists, activists more broadly, who are saying, things not only have they not gotten better, but they've gotten worse. And I include, not just in terms of the conditions of working people, not just the living conditions of First Nations people, but also the condition of our planet, which, as we know, despite the fact that fewer planes are flying, our production of oil and gas, our public purchase of a pipeline is continuing, and the climate emergency is ever more present in our time. This is the time for us to put forward a transformative vision for our economy, for our society, for our planet, and I'm heartened by the work that so many at the grassroots level are doing in the difficult time. Well, and I, if we have a moment, I'd love to talk a bit about some of the work I've been doing with Progressive International as well, Mike, because there are people organizing around the world, and we have lots to learn from them, and lots of inspiration to take from them and from folks on the ground to put forward that bold vision that that we all deserve.
Yeah, sure. Tell us about this Progressive International. I have to say it's stumbled across my news feed a few times, and I've picked up on it. I'm a proud internationalist, and I think the left needs to get its act together on an international scale and start working together. So it sounds like a good development. Fill us in. What exactly is going on?
Great. Well, I'm not surprised it showed up on your feed. The algorithm has done some of its job anyway. But Progressive International is a relatively new movement, and it really it was kicked off actually at an event hosted by the Sanders Institute with Bernie Sanders that I was actually invited to. Had the incredible honor of doing a panel with Senator Bernie Sanders, but along with Yanis Varoufakis as well, and the very progressive mayor of Barcelona, and others as well. And we kicked off Progressive International together, and very much the vision behind it is bringing the left together, thinking globally but acting locally, learning from each other, what's working, what's not working, what are the kinds of innovative campaigns that are out there, how could we build solidarity to make change in our own countries and around the world, and also acknowledging that the right does this all the time, right? I mean, don't we all know how so many right wingers have taken inspiration from the Trump way of doing things? Sadly, even here in our own country. But Progressive International is saying we need to work together. We need to build solidarity. And actually, just heading into tomorrow, together, we've kicked off a campaign to make Amazon pay, making some clear demands around Amazon, acknowledging that Jeff Bezos has benefited more than anyone, literally around the world, thanks to this crisis. And it's time to see Amazon step up for its communities and for the planet. Also acknowledging, one of the ideas behind it is boycotting Amazon for Black Friday. So taking some direct action. So this is the kind of work that Progressive International is doing, and I certainly encourage folks to sign up and become members. There's some incredible resources online, and I know they're looking at some very exciting opportunities going forward to connect all of us and connect us with some folks that are really on the front end. In fact, they sent a delegation to Bolivia to watch the elections. They invited me. I was so sad to say no, but given the circumstances that we're all living in, I didn't want to put my community at risk. So this is the kind of stuff they do. Jeremy Corbyn was actually part of that delegation, so I was particularly sad that I couldn't be on it. But folks like Jeremy Corbyn, Cornel West, like I said, Yanis Varoufakis, a number of Latin American activists and leaders have been connecting with Progressive International. So it's a very it's nascent, but has incredible momentum, and it's what we make of it as well. So I certainly encourage folks tuning into your podcast to take a look and sign up and become a part of it.
Right, and what's the best place to do that?
It's online, and I had pulled it up here. It's Progressive. Okay, let's take a look here. I pulled up the Amazon campaign. It's Progressive International dot something. Progressive dot international. I can send you the link if you search it. It's on my screen.
Sure, you do that, and we'll post it here and make sure people can find out what it's about. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Niki. Hopefully we'll have you back here again sometime, but it's been great, and thanks for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm not going anywhere, so I'll be tuning into your podcast. And again, I can't thank you enough for pulling this together, creating this space. Always, I, like many, watch for your Facebook posts and the world is okay when Mike's saying the things he's saying. So, stay well, Mike, and to all the listeners tuning in, and let's keep connected. Let's keep building that solidarity and pushing for the social, economic, and environmental justice that we all deserve. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you, Niki. Niki Ashton joining us live. We will shortly be bringing on our next guest of the evening, Dr. Arash Azizi. Now he's going to be joining us to talk about his new book, but in the meantime, I'm going to play you another tune from the Apparatchiks album, and while I get Arash online. This song is a song that was written by an Indigenous woman in Vancouver when she was working in Richmond at the salmon cannery there, I believe back in the 70s. Her name was Linda Chobatuk, and we recorded this song about what it was like working in the salmon cannery back then. So while I bring Arash on, you can have a listen.
The dark lays around, race the forklift and sass the floor late till it's time for for their tea. And they sit at the table with a window that opens. They make a buck more an hour than me. High is the smell, low is the pay. Long are the hours, why do we stay? Somewhere outside, a whole summer slips away, while we're stuck in here canning salmon. Machinery's so loud that they say we've gone can deaf. Our shift is long over before we can hear. They keep the noise level right under the limit, so we don't have to buy us the right safety gear. High is the smell, low is the pay. Long are the hours, why do we stay? Somewhere outside, a whole summer slips away, while we're stuck in here canning salmon. So heavy our arms ache. Then we do soccer, which we lift with ease. Then we pack pigs, all mashed up and rotten. So we're packed up in mountains and sent overseas. High is the smell, low is the pay. Long are the hours, why do we stay? Somewhere outside, a whole summer slips away, while we're stuck in here canning salmon. Last night we were waiting for a boat on the Fraser, so they kept us online, just standing around. But we didn't know that outside on the river, a boat had flipped over, 2 men had drowned. High is the cost, low is the pay. Long are the hours, why do we stay? Somewhere outside, a whole summer slips away, while we're stuck in here canning salmon. While we're stuck in here canning salmon.
Well, that was Linda Chopatuk's Canning Salmon, performed by my band, the Apparatchiks. I've just been trying to get Dr. Arash Azizi's on the line here from New York to talk about his new book. Arash, can you hear us?
I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yes, welcome to the show, comrade. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much, comrade. Very good to see you.
So, well, I guess we'll get straight into it. You have a new book out about General Soleimani, who was assassinated by the Americans earlier this year. For those of you who don't know, maybe you can just start by telling us, who was General Soleimani?
I do have a little problem hearing you. It's a bit slow, but maybe we'll be okay with time. But I did understand your question. So Soleimani was a man who was in charge of Iran's military operations abroad. So anything that the IRGC, this is Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, it's a sort of a revolutionary body in Iran tasked. It's basically a paramilitia that is bigger than the actual military. So all of its operations abroad, Soleimani was in charge of them. There was this thing called the Quds Force that he was in charge of from 1998 to when he was killed in 2020. And so he's the man who was able to build the transnational army supported by Iran, of Islamists, of the Iranian kind, and give support to their allies, most importantly in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. And he had risen to be a very important military figure, and by many called him the most sort of powerful operative in the Middle East.
Right. And so, can you talk a little bit about the decision by the Trump administration to assassinate General Soleimani and what exactly that has meant?
Well, it was a very reckless decision, by no doubt. It was something that only really someone like Trump would have done. It was very risky because obviously it's very unlikely. It's very uncommon for a country to kill sort of top military generals of another country, to assassinate rather. In fact, since the United States killed General Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army in the late years of the Second World War, the United States hadn't done that to anybody else until January 2020. So, and the UN and the international community is clear that it was illegal in this sense to assassinate a reigning general like that, and it was also practically very very dangerous. It's true that thankfully it didn't lead to war, but it very well could have had. Now, of course, my politics, and I obviously don't think Soleimani was a good person in any way. He was, he definitely committed many war crimes of his own, and by no way was he a positive figure. In fact, mass movements in Lebanon and Iraq had come to, in the last months of his life, especially, mass movements in both Lebanon and Iraq had come to protest against Iran's imposition there, against the role that Soleimani particularly was playing, which is why his death was celebrated, frankly, by many in Syria and by many in Lebanon, and many in Iraq, and even in Iran. But that's sort of how I would sum up the Trump assassination. It was very reckless and it was definitely illegal according to international law. But I think there's no reason. Actually, at the time, I wrote an article for Plus 972, which is sort of a progressive Israeli-Palestinian magazine, and I said you don't need to mourn to be worried. That sums up my attitude toward the assassination.
And so, what kind of impact has this assassination had on the region? Obviously, Soleimani was a big player. Iran's reach reaches right across the Levant. What impact did this assassination have on the situation on the ground?
The impact that the assassination had was so look, it's been about a year since the assassination happened. He is replaced by a chap called Ismail Qaani, who is very different. He lacks the charisma that Soleimani had. He doesn't even speak Arabic. So he's a very different sort of guy. And I think it has actually led to the weakening of the Islamist forces that Iran supported in Iraq and in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and across the region. So in that sense, it hasn't really been bad news. But of course, one also has to think of the long-term effect, because of course now he's been created as the martyr, and many people who fought by his side, will want to take revenge of one sort or the other. At any rate, when it happened in January 3rd of 2020, we thought this is the big event of the year. Of course, events since then have shown that that's far from the case, since many different events have happened. I think it's crucial in both Iraq and Lebanon are going through a very crucial period in their history, as is Iran. And I think in the next few years, whatever happens, the fact that Soleimani wouldn't be there matters. For example, there are presidential elections next year in Iran, and as I reveal in the book for the first time, Soleimani had planned to run in the elections, actually. So he's not going to be there. There are also elections in Iraq, and whoever, Soleimani not being there means that whoever gets to form a government, they will have one less. Soleimani was a figure who was really able to push his own choices and play a role for that side. So it's good news for Iraq and for Prime Minister of Iraq, Prime Minister Kazemi, who's really trying to have a more independent Iraq, against Iranian and American influence, actually, to make Iraq independent against Iran, the US, Saudi Arabia, and have sort of relations with all of them. So so there is that. And Lebanon, of course, as you know, in August had a big explosion. It's going through its own crises with the sectarian system imposed by the colonial past in Lebanon, and by the more recent colonial American imposition in Iraq. And as people fight against their, I would say, those who support Iran's colonial influence in these countries, and also those who support the sectarian system have they've lost one of their most important figures. So in no way do I, of course, support assassination that is explained, but the fact of the matter is him not being there is a good news for the progressive forces of the region.
So where do you see things going next in Iran and more broadly in the region? I'm sorry, that's obviously a huge question, but
well, you and I come from a political tradition. We were both, for some years at least, in a political tradition which loved perspectives, as you know. So, I haven't quite kicked the habit, even though I've become a historian, where you're kind of discouraged to predict the future. But I love to offer some perspectives. The Trotsky's magical, what was it? Foresight over astonishment. Yeah, no, Trotsky said they can have foresight over astonishment if you just knew Marxism, but yeah, the crystal ball that doesn't always work out. Look, so, and of course I'm a participant in politics as well, so any prediction is not just, it's not a prediction, it's also a hope. Iran has a Islamist dictatorship that plays a very negative role in the region. And, since this is you, after all, and I imagine some of your listeners, would be more interested in stuff related to the left. Let me tell you this. What I try to say in the book, what I try to show, I have a chapter called "No Islamism in One Country," by the way, which should appeal to those who know sort of the language of the left. But what I try to explain is that Iran's brand of transnational Islamism, that it grew and spread in the region, really only was able to spread itself after the violent suppression of communism in both Iraq and in Lebanon, where Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, killed a large number of the Lebanese Communist Party members. And anyways, I get into more detail of how some communists actually make the transition to become Islamists and support. They now see Iran as the new Moscow in a very weird way. Now, how does this tie to a question? Is that I think Iran's Islamic Republic has played a very negative role in the region and has been bad news for progressive movements in the region. So its demise, challenges to it, is obviously good news. And now the reality is, under the imperialist sanctions imposed by the US, the Iranian people are going through a very hard time, as are the Syrian people and Lebanese people who are affected by this. And the fact of the matter is that at the same time, the regime in Iran is very much weakened. And the hope for the future, of course, is that it would be replaced, that it would be supplanted by the movements of people. Now, the movements in Iran are very disparate. Unfortunately, they're also weakened. There's not a lot of hope given the realities of the sanctions, of the poverty that has been imposed. But the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, is 81 years old. So it's very likely that he will die in the next decade. And the IRGC, this military that I talked about, which is the military, but also like a big economic power, it's very likely to control the next president, whoever he is. But I think there is a admission even on part of the Iranian ruling class that this can't go on. Things can't go on with the way that they have been. So while I don't have a very positive prognosis in the near future, I think it's not that far-fetched to say that in Iran you will see huge changes in the last, let's say 10 years. But in Iraq and Lebanon, things are looking even better and rosier, and I can have more easy predictions of perspectives there as well. Iraq has elections next year, as I said, and I think it's very likely that the majority of the parliament will go to progressive forces that really want to defend Iraq's sovereignty and also build a better future for the country, not least the Communist Party in Iraq, which actually did come up on. It was a junior partner in an alliance with a very questionable force that did come first in the last parliamentary elections, even though they couldn't form a government because they came first, but they still didn't have a majority in the parliament. And in Lebanon as well, I think there's a very serious questioning of the sectarian system that has been imposed since the formation of the country after the Second World War. So, so as a good, optimistic Marxist, I think in all the three countries that are, I think the main countries that are discussed in the book, there are reasons to be optimistic.
So you mentioned earlier the explosion that happened in Lebanon, that obviously made headlines around the world, but I think really profoundly impacted the consciousness of people there. Realization that such a disaster was waiting for them out of pure negligence, out of their own authorities. I recognize this is a bit of a tangent and off topic, but can you talk maybe a bit about the fallout from that?
Yeah, no, it's not off topic actually. But I mean, it's not in the book because it actually happened while I was writing the book and toward the very end when I was writing the book, I guess. I kind of wrapped it up in August, which is when it happened. But it's definitely not off topic. We can talk about anything tonight. But look, yeah, so the explosion it's one of actually the biggest man-made explosions in recorded human history. It killed a lot of people. It was an absolute economic disaster. Of course, COVID-19 had already been very bad news for Lebanon's economy, but this was really destructive. It destroyed much of downtown Beirut. The Beirut port where the explosion happened is really close to the main sort of areas of downtown Beirut. So really, since the civil war ended in Lebanon in 1990, perhaps this was one of the biggest catastrophes, along with the killing of Rafiq Hariri, Lebanese prime minister, in 2005. But the fallout, I think, look, so since last year, yes, since 2019, there was a movement in Lebanon which was called Thora, or Revolution. This was really a movement of, mostly young people from across all different ethnicities and religions in Lebanon. And at the same time, a movement was going on in Iraq. And really, these movements had two basic demands. One of it is basically good government, if you will, which I know is the slogan in Canada, but it really mattered somewhat differently here. It mattered because they basically wanted the government that it was more like the old socialist slogan of, wanting basic services, right? So wanting the government to offer, the most basic services, health, education, but also picking up garbage, things like that, which actually garbage has been a subject of more than one movement in Lebanon in recent years. So that was one aspect. And the other aspect was against the Iranian undue influence in both these countries, in Iraq and Lebanon, through the imposition of the Shia forces in these countries. And this was linked to also an opposition, which you can say the third aspect, which is linked to the second aspect of this sectarian system. For the viewers who don't know, Iraq and Lebanon, I've talked about it a couple of times today, have a system in which all positions of power are assigned based on different, basically ethno-sectarian basis, right? So every person is a member of an ethno-sectarian, right? They're either Arab Shia, or they are Kurdish, or in Lebanon there's like I think 17 or 18 recognized, like they're Armenian Christian, they're Druze, which is a religious minority considered Muslim in Lebanon, and all positions of power are given according to this, and by not only prime minister, president, but even lower than that, all ministers, deputy ministers. And of course this has created the condition of all the things that you can imagine, but ruled by a elite from each of these ethno-sectarian groups. And people in Lebanon and Iraq really came out against it. Now the explosion in August really highlighted how corrupt this system was. The fact that there was huge amount of this explosive ammonium nitrate in the port and no one had done anything about it really just showed how much corruption really existed. And the government in Lebanon, which is supported by Hezbollah, Iran's ally Hezbollah, really has seen ever more rage against it because of it. It has fallen since then. There's another chap who's now tasked with forming of the government, but the same old elites are still there. The tragedy is that the Lebanese people have come out time and time again, but you really need a strategy to smash the sectarian system. I should say that the treaty that ended the Lebanese civil war in 1989, the Treaty of Taif, unlike what people think, people usually say it establishes a sectarian system. Actually, it promises to abolish this system, but it says that it will keep it temporarily, but the temporarily has gone on for more than 30 years now. So the real question is finding those political leaders who are up to the task of destroying this sectarian system. And I should say the Lebanese Communist Party, which is a small but powerful force, that has a few thousand members and is active, is obviously against the sectarian system as well, although it is it is in no way powerful enough to lead this movement. But it's as I said, this is a task of a broad national progressive movement in Lebanon to carry this through, because you can't get rid of the corruption so long as you have the sectarian system.
So I'm sure you've heard the reports that Netanyahu was in Saudi Arabia over the weekend for meetings with the Crown Prince, secret meetings, of course. Rumor is that Iran was one of the major subjects on the table. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so the Saudis denied that the meeting took place, but it is likely to have taken place, especially since Israeli media is discussing it. And also Netanyahu, as you know, is now part of a coalition government in Israel, and the defense ministry is held by Benny Gantz, who is sort of a more liberal Zionist and heads the rival centrist party of Blue and White. And Benny Gantz and the leadership of the army seem to be furious with Netanyahu for not having told them about the meeting. So it is likely to have taken place. Look, it's a very dangerous time. In the next 2 months, we have the lame duck period of Trump's presidency. And, this is a period in which he ostensibly, can do what he wants because he doesn't have to face the electorate anymore. The New York Times came up with a report not that long ago that Trump had very seriously considered attacking Iran in this period before his own advisors talked him out of it. So, of course, if Israel or the United States are thinking of using this 2 months period to attack Iran, it's very dangerous that this could have been raised, between MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and Netanyahu. But I think it's unlikely. I think they're not foolish enough to want to do this. Frankly, it would be absolute disaster, and the consequences of which would be also unpredictable for Israel. And whatever you want to say about Netanyahu, he's not. I don't think he's stupid enough to do that. It's not even clear that would help his own electoral prospects. As we know, he's very corrupt and he's facing trials in Israel himself. So I think they're probably just trying to exchange notes as to what to do, not that their favorite guy, Trump, is going to be out of office and you're going to have a Joe Biden administration. But it's certainly something to be very worried about, because a war breaking out in Iran or around Iran, it is possible, especially since in Iraq and in Persian Gulf, there are many possibilities of clashes, and it would be an absolute humanitarian disaster that would dwarf the Iraq war. It would be a humanitarian disaster, it would be a political disaster. It would upset all of these progressive hopes that I talked about in Iraq and Lebanon, and even long-term in Iran. So it is, of course, the basic duty of progressive everywhere in the West and in Israel to always oppose any such possibility and be alert to it.
And of course, we've been aware since the Bush administration that Iran has been a major target for the American military-industrial complex. Certainly, Palm Pompeo and others might see this as their last chance to get it done, and that's something that's weighed on my mind. That being said, we haven't seen any of the sort of build-up you typically see towards a war in the public consciousness, and the long stream of media leading us eventually to that conclusion. So I think any sort of war that might happen between now and January 20th would have to be by surprise.
Yeah, I don't think, actually, the New York Times report said even Pompeo talked Trump out of it. I think, look, again, yes, these are people who personally hate the government in Iran, and, they've been looking, they used to be, by the way, in the ways of the Iraq war, the saying allegedly in neoconservative circles was, I say it in my book, actually, that the boys go to Iraq, real men go to Iran. So they've been wanting to do that. But I think you're right, and I don't think, as I said, they're stupid enough to do this in this sort of lame duck period, especially. But the Biden administration will have its own challenges with Iran. I think at some point it has to go back to the negotiation table. The United States already imposed the heaviest sanctions in human history, and in no government, since the time of pharaohs in Egypt, no government has ever imposed so many sanctions on other people. So they can't do any more of that. I mean, in fact, probably they'll have to release, some of the pressure. But it is likely that they can get around to the negotiating table, and try to achieve something there. But it's a difficult task, and of course we have to see it next to all the other developments that have happened and are happening in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. And how would you expect the Biden administration to be different in relation to Iran, or do you expect them to be different?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly will be different, right? There certainly will be different. I mean, for one thing, I mean, let's talk about it. Yeah, Trump had really, I mean, number one, we know who Trump was. I mean, well, when it comes to foreign policy, let me say, he had given the reign of his foreign policy to people like Pompeo, a bunch of people whose real constituency were really right-wing Christians in the U.S., sort of really right-wing extremist Christians, really, who really thought they had some sort of a biblical plans for the Middle East. And what they did was that in Israel, for example, they gave green light to Netanyahu for all outrageous actions against international law and human rights of the Palestinian people, demolition of homes in the West Bank, expansion of the illegal settlements in the West Bank, and of course they did this very dangerous course of action against Iran by brinksmanship, by imposing sanctions on Iran. So definitely things will be different under Biden. Now, how they'll be different, we gotta see. Now, Antony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, is someone that actually was praised by some of the people on the left recently, like Matt Duss, the foreign policy advisor of Bernie Sanders. Of course, we're talking about limits of American empire, if you will, and the sort of U.S. foreign policy. But also the U.S. itself is going through important political time. There will be pressure from the left on the Democratic administration. It's my belief that Democratic administration like Biden would be more amenable to pressure coming from the left. After all, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in our own New York here, Bernie Sanders, and others, will have, can justly claim that they helped bring victory to Biden, so they'll try to push for their own demand. So I think they'll definitely will be different. And Blinken has been noted by some people like Matt Duss, the Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor, as someone who has before worked with some of the grassroots forces. I might listen to them now. I think the real question, Mike, insofar as left is concerned, is that we gotta be clear about two things. First of all, what is a true foreign policy alternative that we want to have for the United States? Because that hasn't always been clear, frankly. It's one thing to say bring the troops home, but that slogan today doesn't really work because it's not like US necessarily has a lot of troops in many places actually. I mean, of course it has military bases, but that's a different story. The question is, what would be our true foreign policy alternative, and also what are some of the particular demands we can push? I think in relations to Iran, and we gotta develop this and think about it, but in relation to Iran, I think what the progressive position as an Iranian progressive and as American progressive would be to bring down the threat of war and do enter negotiations with Iran over the nuclear program in the spirit that we had before under Obama that led to the Iran deal, and enable more people contact actually between Iran and the US, which will effectively and in the long term be also useful for the path of democracy in Iran. But anyways, this is just the beginning of it. I think left in the United States is just coming to its own. It's an exciting fact that we can now speak of a socialist left in the United States. You know, when you and I were in the NDP years ago, we used to, you know, when we booed Obama's sort of people from NDP conventions and all that, we used to sort of think that, well, Canada has its own NDP, has a Labour Party, the United States doesn't. I think now a lot of Canadians would even maybe look at with envy at Bernie Sanders and the kind of socialist movement that he was able to put up. But of course, he's very old and is going to go away. So I think the question of how to build a socialist left would also have to go through how does a socialist left put demands on the foreign policy of the strongest imperialist power in the world. And I don't think we really have the answers to that. And we certainly have a lot of wrong answers, if you ask me, if you look at the left. Because I think the left failed to make the transition easy, because if this was the 70s, it was easy. The Vietnam War, first you want the US forces to come home. Second, you kind of have sympathy for the Vietnamese people who were fighting a just war. The complex multi-imperialist wars today in Syria and Iraq and Middle East are not like that. So as a result, we have leftists sometimes becoming fans of Taliban, sometimes becoming fans of Putin, sometimes becoming fans of Assad, you know, all these unsavory regimes in the region, and that's not good. So, you know, it's up to us to build a serious foreign policy alternative. And I think if you look at the history of the left, like Communist Party in the United States back in the day, did make good efforts to do that. You know, the question is how to, I mean, of course, for them at the time, good foreign policy always also meant sort of friendship with the Soviet Union. But I think the important thing to learn from them was that they were able to really have foreign policy demands and foreign policy alternatives that was, you know, that was good for the conditions of their country, America, at the time. And that's the kind of things we need to do.
So, this book you've put out, it doesn't just, and I haven't
put it out here, by the way.
oh yeah, get your plug in, absolutely. No, I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet. I promise I will.
Of course.
But it's not just a biography of Soleimani, but it also talks in the title about Iran's foreign ambitions. So
yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on that? Where is Iran going? What are their ambitions?
Yeah, so basically in the book is really a history, if you will, of the last 40 years, really a history of how the Islamic Republic was founded, how the revolution of 1979 in Iran led to the foundation of this Islamic Republic, and what kind of foreign policy Iran started to have, and how it started to spread its rule. Now, as I explained earlier, the imposition of the type of Islamism that Iran spread in the region very much came with violent suppression of the left at some points, and that's discussed in the book. Yeah, I think, you know, but the reactions that I've had so far, I think, you know, I definitely wrote the book for the general audience, if you would, right? So it's not, I didn't write it for specialists. So my hope is that you read this book through the history of this one man who also was someone who came from the tribes of southern Iran. He came from sort of very marginalized background and rose to positions of leadership in Iran. I tried through the history of this man, tell the history of Iran in the last, actually you can say 60 years, because I also discuss he's grown up, you know, in the 1960s. but mostly after the revolution. And the Iran's global ambition is the story of how Iran. This is interesting, Mike, because the 1979 revolution gave Iran a internationalist ethos at the beginning that, like all revolutions, they had some internationalist ambitions. They wanted to help the Irish Republican Army, IRA. In fact, they changed the name of the street. Popular sort of protest in the streets changed the name of the street on which the British embassy located from Winston Churchill to Bobby Sands, the historic leader of the IRA. And to this day, it's called the Bobby Sands Avenue. So the British diplomats, when they pop out to have a sandwich, they gotta go to the Bobby Sands Avenue. And that shows you the kind of internationalism that existed at the beginning of the revolution. They gave support to the Black Panther Party in the US and all sort of things. But unfortunately, this internationalism was replaced very soon. This other man knocks. Why just moved also in my bookcase. The internationalism became a very sectarian movement that tried to impose a Shia Sunni logic, Shia and Sunni being the two big sects of Islam, on the struggles of the region, and also even very openly advance Iran's imperial ambitions, frankly, in the region. So that this book is really a story of how internationalism of '79 has turned itself to the sectarian and quasi-imperial mode of Iranian global ambition in 2020.
And so what do you think is next for Iran? What are the next steps? How are they going to deal with the nuclear issue, the new administration? What can we expect to see?
Yeah, so as I said, perspectives. I think Iran and Khamenei are at such a desperate mode that they will enter negotiations at some point, even when they say they won't. And I think they will give up again part of the nuclear program. And the main asks of the US has been around the nuclear program, but there's also the question of ballistic missiles and the question of Iran's sort of role in the region. I think they'll withdraw a bit, and especially in the nuclear program, and probably reach some sort of a deal with the US and the Europe on that, and that should lead to the lifting of some sanctions. But we have to see this process. It's very beginning, and we also got to see there is about a few months left, 6 months or so left of the presidency of Rouhani, the president of Iran today, who negotiated successfully the last Iran deal. The next presidential election is very likely that the leadership won't allow any of the people like so-called moderates of Rouhani to run, and they will probably dominated by conservatives and IRGC types. And really, we got to see what kind of future Iran will have then. But I think it's very likely that even if they're there, some sort of negotiation will happen and some sort of deal will be reached. But they won't be able to solve the fundamental contradictions. And of course, those of us who advocated for Iran deal, and I did, and I think the hope is that as Iran has even more trade relations with the West and with the world, that will actually open up the country and ultimately weaken the dictatorship in Iran. It's more of a long game, but it's certainly better than the current situation where sanctions make people suffer, but also close up the country and, strengthen its dictatorial leadership.
So, I mean, that last point, maybe you can just expand a little bit on that. And I'll ask you directly, do you think that these sanctions have any impact at all on weakening the regime or their ambitions?
Well, I mean, obviously they can weaken the regime in a sense that they put into crisis and all that. But ultimately, no regime has ever really fallen funnily enough, by the economic sanctions. Saddam in Iraq didn't fall by economic sanctions. Um, the North Korean regime hasn't fallen by enormous economic sanctions. It has never really worked in history. Putin's Russia has never really fallen. So it's kind of clear that these sanctions will always have a reactionary consequences, especially in the long term. Now, sometimes if you say the sanctions in the short term will bring a government to negotiating table for whatever purposes, but effectively, no. I think they've strengthened the most conservative sections of the Iranian regime effectively and caused mass suffering. I think sanctions should be illegal, frankly, and they are kind of according to international law, and they're never I mean, the very idea that you cause mass suffering in another country to influence the actions of its government is pretty barbaric, isn't it? And when we say mass suffering, I mean, this is, people in Iran not having the most basic medications. This is sometimes denied. They say, oh, we didn't sanction the medicine. Of course, you don't need to sanction medicine, but, I can't send $100 to, my grandma in Iran because it's banned. All financial transactions are banned. And Iranians faced enormous types of discrimination. Actually, those who live abroad, they can't even apply to universities, this and that. So, to answer your question, they have weakened the regime in one sense. That obviously they have less access to money and all that, but they have not weakened the hold of the regime over the country. And even though these are the most draconian sanctions in history. But as I said, as the case of North Korea shows, you can have a country that is cut off from much of the world, but it will be, and Iran is a much more important country than North Korea, much bigger, with much more people, with much more links. No matter how much you limit it, you can't limit like North Korea, which really has only border with one country. They have not weakened the hold of the regime on the people. In fact, if I was Khamenei, frankly, the supreme leader of Iran, I would have cheered for Trump in the last presidential elections, which he did, by the way, endorse Trump 4 years ago, as he said, he's the man who tells the truth. Don't call him a demagogue. That's a direct quote from Khamenei. So this reaction is like each other, and I would have really preferred him because, it gave justification to all his statements about the United States, but also it empowers him, because the more you have, in fact, the Iran deal was a grave threat for them because, as I said, the more country opens up, and the more the type of dictatorial rule that Khamenei has and the type of policies he pushes would become unjustifiable, because even from a capitalist perspective, they'll in fact threaten the capitalist logic.
So they may succeed in plunging a country into crisis with these kind of sanctions, but ultimately these regimes rule by crisis, and so it doesn't threaten them in any real way.
Especially, unfortunately, one of the reasons for the persistence of the regime in Iran is that we don't really have a unified, credible, organized opposition. Unfortunately, I mean that's the tragedy of Iran, and for a good reason, because the regime has tried very hard to suppress any progressive or really any sort of opposition to it, and it has been successful, unfortunately, in this regard. But changes are much more likely to come from inside Iran by social movements, by civic movements, and by cracks inside the sanctions. Have not helped any of that. They have strengthened the most hardline conservative sections in Iran.
So a number of years ago, you remember there was the Green Movement, the uprising that was put down more or less. Is there any hope on the horizon for revolutionary change in Iran?
Yeah, well, the leaders of the Green Movement, by the way, Musavi Karubi and Rahnavard, are today still in house detention. They were there since 2011, actually, when they called for demonstration support of the on the Arab Spring. Um, Look, so yes, I do think there is hope for change. The movements of people since then have been suppressed in blood time and time again. The last time, just a year ago, November 2019, where masses of Iranians came out across the country with economic demands, really, and they were suppressed. And this is the second time. They also came out in 2017, 18, all over the country. We called it a geographic class because the name of the cities of the protest are many Iranians haven't even heard of these cities. So it was really a vast movement. I think, as I said, Khamenei will die at some point. That will create a vacuum in power. Now, I'm not saying that would immediately be end of the regime, but the fact of the matter is that the Iranian people will come out. They have shown that they'll come out time and time again. If you looked at it, 1999, 2009, I just noted other two examples. The question is that because there is no organized opposition, it's unlikely that it's unlikely for people to have hope to come out for something. Now, but I do think the end of regime in Iran would probably be similar to, say, Spain or Indonesia or Philippines, where you had the death of this long-time tyrant, and then the establishment couldn't agree on the next leader. They'll fight within themselves, and you can have imposition of some sort of people power that could lead to more open conditions. I think that's one of the things you can have hope for in the future of Iran. A situation like the three countries that I mentioned: Indonesia, Philippines, and Spain. Spain, had more organized politics, so probably more Indonesia and Philippines when our Suharto and Marcos in one dies.
So, just one final point here before you go. Take the opportunity in 30 seconds. Tell us why we should buy your book. Hold it up. Where can we get it? Give us your plug.
There we go. Well, I was not a good salesman, but Shadow Commander, it's here. I think you should buy it because if you just want a good story, number one, that's sort of baseline. It's a very interesting story of how a man came from sort of margins of Iranian society and rose to become a worldwide known general to the degree that Trump sort of had to kill him. And is also a good sum up of not just Iran, but Middle East as a whole, really, because it's about what Iran is trying to do in the Middle East. And if you wanna, always support my first books of socialist Marxist authors. It's always it's always good to get them. And where you can get them, I won't say the name of the bad website. The big guy we all hate. They have it, but I encourage you. I mean Amazon. Yeah. But I encourage you not to get it from Amazon if you can. If you can get it, it actually has very good distribution in both Canada and the US. In Canada, well, Indigo has it. It's slightly better than Amazon, maybe, but also I know Pegasus Bookstore. I haven't lived in Toronto for some years, but Pegasus Bookstore, which is a sort of independent bookstore in Toronto, has it. And